Diana is a Middle East cultural expert with a special focus on Syria, with degrees in Arabic from Oxford University and in Islamic art and architecture from SOAS. She spent over 30 years specializing in the region, working across the government and commercial sectors. Amongst their publications are the highly acclaimed My House in Damascus, an inside view of the Syrian crisis from 2016, 2018, and The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo in 2019. Whilst her most recent book, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, which is the topic of this session, received 3 Book of the Year awards in 2020. Whilst her next book on the Ottomans and their cultural legacy is set to be published next month. She's been frequently invited to speak at international events and feature on media, including the BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, whilst her work on Syria has been published again by the BBC, Sunday Times, and The Guardian. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. So without further ado, over to you, Diana.
Right, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming and attending this Zoom lecture, and thank you very much to the Islamic Society of Britain for inviting me. And I'm going to begin by explaining the title of the book, because that has proved to be quite controversial, Stealing from the Saracens. And let me explain that this was very carefully chosen. Every word has been carefully chosen because the word Saracen has to be in the title because of Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's Cathedral over on the right-hand side there, the English masterpiece. And Christopher Wren said that when he built the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, he used Saracen vaulting. That was the language of the 17th century. Saracen meant Arab Muslim. And so he said, I used Saracen vaulting because it was the best. So stealing from the Saracens, the derivation of the word Saracens in Arabic is from the root saraka, to steal. So Saracens, Sarakin, are thieves, if you like. So it's a deliberate double irony saying, isn't it ridiculous that we call people thieves when actually we took things from them? So it's a double pun, if you like, on the, it's meant to be slightly funny, but people have taken it very literally and become sort of outraged. How can you talk about stealing, and what is this word Saracens? So I'm explaining why it's chosen with great care. And so the cover itself of the book shows the interior of the dome of St. Paul's. So that circular shape where the title is written, that is the very center of the internal dome of St. Paul's, where he used Saracen vaulting. So this is the reason for the title. So now I'm going to explain why I wrote the book in the first place. And it was basically because of the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in France in April 2019. And when I saw the extraordinary global reaction to this event, I was just so astonished to hear that people in France were coming out saying, oh, our national identity is going up in flames. And it was seen as a great European icon of architecture. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, why don't you know the backstory of Gothic architecture? Don't you realize that pretty much every architectural feature of Gothic architecture is being taken from much further east? It's nothing to do with Europe. And because that knowledge seemed to have disappeared off the face of the earth, even though people like Christopher Wren back in the 17th century acknowledged it and said that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style, again in the language of the 17th century. But this knowledge seemed to have disappeared. So on the day of the fire, the morning after, I put out a tweet just saying, you know, that the origin of all Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame is in Syria. And what's more, the prototype of it is still standing in the rebel province of Idlib, in spite of the bombs and the ongoing war. And the reaction was just extraordinary. I mean, you know, it kind of, it sparked something. And I realized, my goodness, people just don't know this, because for me, as a specialist in this part of the world, I'm very familiar with all the architecture of the Middle East. I've had the opportunity to go in person, you know, since my 20s to all of these places. So I'm very, very familiar with them. It was very, very obvious to me what the links were. So I just assumed that this was common knowledge. Anyway, clearly it wasn't. And so, you know, the tweet turned into an article. The article turned into a book, essentially. But had it not been for the fire of Notre Dame, I would never have written this book. So it sort of opened whole avenues for me in an extraordinary way. And on the right-hand side of your screen there, this decapitated saint is Saint Denis, the patron saint of France. And that statue is on the front, on the west facade, the front main entrance facade of Notre Dame Cathedral. And one of the things I uncovered in my researches is that there were an awful lot of what I call medieval muddles, where knowledge and identities became very confused, because basically, of course, there's no such thing as the internet. People couldn't check their facts. And a lot of the time, publications existed claimed by authors who claimed that they were this or that, that turned out many centuries later to have been frauds, basically. And so it turned out that one of the key influences on the abbot of Saint Denis, that's Saint Denis, who was credited with the invention of Gothic architecture, had been very influenced by the writings of somebody claiming to be Denis, an apostle, a disciple of St. Paul, of the Apostle Paul. Later, that was turned out to be a fraud, and the real Denis, the person who really wrote this very influential treatise, turned out to be a Syrian monk from the late 5th century. So this is where the story takes us to Syria. And on your screen now, you'll see one of the so-called dead cities in Syria. Now, these are an extraordinary collection of over 2,000 churches scattered on the hills west and south of Aleppo in Syria. So most of them actually fall within what is currently Idlib province, so still rebel held, not under the Assad regime, hasn't been since 2011. And this particular one is Segilla, it's called. And this extraordinary collection of early Christian architecture, again, has been largely forgotten, just completely overlooked. And yet it is a treasure house of very early Christian architecture. Because don't forget, for the first 300 years, Christianity was being persecuted by the Romans, the Roman Empire. And so there were no churches as such. I mean, people had to worship underground or secretly. Only when Constantine accepted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire were people allowed to openly start to build churches. So that began in the 4th century. And so from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, what you've got here in Syria is the most incredible collection of early Christian architecture, the biggest collection anywhere in the world. And it's largely unknown. I mean, you know, I've had the privilege to go there many, many times, you know, starting off in my 20s. So I've known about these buildings for decades. On the left is one of the most influential of these churches within the so-called dead cities. It's called Kalb Lawze, which means the heart of the almond. And it is the earliest example of twin towers flanking a monumental entrance. And the reason for this design is that it was to receive pilgrims along the route to St. Simeon's Basilica, which still exists. It's a little bit northwest of Aleppo. And St. Simeon was a priest who preached from the top of a stylite. He's St. Simeon Stylites is his correct title. Stylite, it's from the Greek stylus, meaning pillar, and he preached from the top of a pillar. And all that's left of his pillar is that little stump that you can see there, because pilgrims would come to it and chip off a little souvenir from it after his death. And so that's all that's left of it. And even that stump was actually blown to smithereens in a Russian airstrike back in 2015, because sadly the war is ongoing still in this part of Syria. And so St. Simeon's Basilica, you have to realize, was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. It was the most important shrine anywhere in Christendom. So the architecture of the way stations on the way to the pilgrimage site were incredibly influential in Europe, and pilgrims travelled in their thousands, on foot, on horseback, to Syria from Europe to worship at this basilica. And the architecture that you see there now, all of the dead cities are built in these limestone hills of Syria. So the local stonemasons became incredibly skilled, because limestone was the building material that was to hand. There were not many trees, so they learnt to do everything with stone. And the level of their craftsmanship was colossal. So here we are looking at a 5th century now. This is built in 490. We're looking at the top of a pillar with acanthus leaves, which are carved to look as if they're blowing in the wind. Such is the skill of the local Syrian stonemasons. So the skill of stonemasonry in Syria is literally as old as the hills. And so the influence of St. Simeon back in Europe is clear to see in so many ways. So on the left there is a stained glass window of St. Simeon in the village of St. Simeon in France, east of Paris. It's one of several villages in France named after St. Simeon. And there he is on his pillar. On the right-hand side is a mosaic of St. Simeon preaching from his pillar, and that one is in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. So that is the Christian, the pre-existing Christian foundations, if you like, that already existed inside Syria, in the Eastern Mediterranean, which, when the first Muslim conquest took place under the Umayyads, that was already there as the very influential basis for then the development of early Islamic architecture. And the first thing that the Umayyads built, the first statement building that they built, is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And this was built in 690. So when you look at that, some people look at it and say, oh, it's just a Byzantine building. It's just a copy of the early Christian things. And in some ways, that's true. It's an octagonal structure, and some early Christian martyria for martyrs were octagonal, and some did have domes. But there are very, very different things about this first Islamic architectural statement. For a start, all the color and decoration is on the outside, along with the inscription running around the outside, which is an admonishment to Christians saying, you should not believe in the Trinity. There is only one God. In a Christian basilica, they look very plain from the outside. All the mosaic decoration is on the inside. But there are two major innovations here in the Dome of the Rock, which again get largely overlooked. But if you look at this cross section of the dome itself, in the Dome of the Rock, you will see up beneath the dome itself you'll see a little arcade of trefoil arches, these little triple-shaped arches. And that is the very first time that they appear anywhere in the world as an architectural feature. And of course, the trefoil arch is incredibly common in Gothic architecture. It is all over all of the medieval cathedrals. And at the bottom arches, if you look carefully, you'll see that in the center, you've got two rounded arches. And on either side of that, in the group of four there in the center, you've got the beginnings of a pointed arch. And again, this is the first time that the pointed arch appears in Islamic architecture. There is no pointed arch in Byzantine architecture or early Christian architecture. It is the first time that it occurs. And the Umayyads then went on to build a number of other structures, obviously very important ones, like the great Umayyad mosque in Damascus. And so when you look at this, the Umayyad mosque in Damascus, you can see immediately that, again, it's this sort of blended architecture that you have the dome, which could be said to be Byzantine. You have the gable over on the left there, like a Greek temple. And don't forget that Syria was covered in Greco-Roman remains like Palmyra. So again, the early Islamic architects and designers had all of these examples of things that they could use and adapt. And then the minaret there in the front looks to a Western eye like a bell tower. And again, there's a reason for that, because all the bell towers of the churches that were all over Syria were square like that. And so the first minarets were square, copying those. And this one is actually called the Jesus minaret because local tradition has it that on the Day of Judgment, Christ will descend from this minaret. And this is very typical of the sort of blending of Christian and Muslim traditions and folklore and practices in this part of the world, in Syria. I mean, to this day, inside the old city of Damascus, you've still got 17 churches, as well as all the mosques. And on a Sunday morning, the church bells ring out and they blend with the call to prayer. It is totally natural blending of the two cultures. Now, this is a detail of the mosaic inside the Great Umayyad Mosque. And I'm showing you this because it's one of the very earliest examples of Islamic art. And like all Islamic art, it's basically visions of paradise. It is gardens, trees, rivers, fantasized buildings, and the beautiful colors of the gold and the green are taken from Byzantine craftsmen will have been responsible for this. They were the skilled mosaicists, but now for the first time they are working to new Umayyad masters, and so the style is changing. But the craft is Byzantine, but the design is to Islamic specifications now. But again, the early Islamic architects have adapted earlier examples. So you've got this triple window there, which is taken directly from the churches that pre-existed in Syria, and the triple window representing the Trinity in all churches, and the two columns there in pink marble, just like the columns and capitals of Greco-Roman sites, which, as I say, like Palmyra and Apamea, and many others all over Syria. So these were the pre-existing inspirations, if you like, that Islamic architecture could build upon and synthesize something new, something distinctive. Also, in Umayyad architecture, the palaces that they built for the early caliphs. This is actually the entrance to the Damascus National Museum. And it is the twin towers again, with a monumental entrance, but this time the towers are now round. And this is the entrance to the palace called Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi, and it is very fragmentary, but all the styles that you can begin to see in Islamic architecture are present there. So when you now look close up at the detailing of some of these early Umayyad palaces, so this one is from a palace called Mushatta, which is actually now on display in Berlin, in the Islamic Museum within the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. You can get right up close to this to see the sheer quality of the stonemasonry. And again, all Islamic decoration like this is very distinctive. It is nature, that the energy, the fertility, it's foliage and vegetation and flowers and animals intertwined in all of this, and it's kind of bursting with a new life and an effusive energy. And this is again very, very influential in how Gothic develops later. Now, still with the Umayyad palaces, one of the other innovations that has been found at the palace of Khirbat al-Mafja, which is near Jericho in what is today the occupied West Bank, the excavators found the very earliest rose window. And this was in the audience chamber of the caliph, and it was high up. This is a recreation of it, but they can tell from the fragments that they found that this is what it would have looked like. And it was high up in the audience chamber, and they found sections of colored glass in it. So it was designed as a decorative window to let in light in a very special place. So just like the rose windows of medieval cathedrals, the absolute pinnacle of which is over on the right-hand side there at Chartres Cathedral, the beautiful rose window at Chartres, which took 7 more centuries to evolve from the prototype, if you like, on the left. And Syrian glass is another whole area that the researchers for this book brought me into, which I wasn't aware of before. And this was absolutely fascinating to learn that the actual glass itself in medieval cathedrals, in the early cathedrals, in the 12th century cathedrals, it was all Syrian glass, because Syria was the world leader in glass at that time. And when the Crusaders took their Latin kingdoms, they conquered Jerusalem, they basically took over the glass industry, if you like, and shipped out huge quantities from Antioch, ancient Antioch, what is modern Antakya, in the southeast of Turkey. They shipped it out in huge quantities to Europe, because Europe simply didn't have glass of this quality, this beautiful, soft, very easy to work glass that was incredibly strong. And one of my theories actually is that because the glass in Notre Dame Cathedral was made from this incredible, strong Syrian glass with these tiny bubbles in it, it was the reason it didn't all shatter in the fire. It's the reason it survived. It all had to be cleaned, but most of the glass, the stained glass, is actually intact. And on the right-hand side there is a goblet made of Syrian glass, and you can see this in the V&A Museum in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is one of their prize exhibits. It's absolutely beautiful. It's called the Luck of Edenhall, and it was brought back to this country by a returning crusader who obviously had it made in Syria, and it's got enameled paintwork on it, which again is a technique that was developed in Syria, way ahead of when all these techniques gradually developed in Europe. So that's the Syrian Umayyad story, if you like, the very first Islamic dynasty. But of course, in 750, the Umayyads were wiped out by the Abbasids, and all the Umayyad leaders and family was killed, except for one prince, Abdurrahman, the Umayyad prince, and he, by some miracle, managed to escape and make his way across North Africa and into Spain, where he set up the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. And so this is, Andalusia, as it's generally referred to. Muslim Spain is essentially Syria in Spain. I mean, everything that the Umayyads did in Syria, they then brought it to Spain. So all this technology, what we're looking at now is the Cordoba Mesquita. That's what they still, even though today it is a cathedral, you can see in the center that the Ferdinand and Isabella at the Reconquista built a cathedral in the middle of the mosque, which is a very controversial thing to do, obviously. And although it is, strictly speaking, a cathedral, it is still known locally as the Mesquita, which is Spanish for mosque. And the Cordoba Mesquita, again, is an incredibly influential building. So it's got a bell tower, and its minaret, it was built as a minaret in the square Umayyad shape, going up in tapering registers. And so now that has been converted to the bell tower. Inside, in one of the later extensions in the 10th century, because the mosque, the Cordoba Mesquita, was extended by subsequent caliphs, in the 10th century, this extraordinary vaulted dome was built in front of the mihrab. And it is the most unbelievable example of perfect geometry, the use of early geometry in which the Syrians excelled. And again, this kind of knowledge did not exist in Europe at this time. And only fairly recently, I think it was 2017, a couple of Spanish structural engineers got permission to do a structural survey on this dome, and they were completely flabbergasted with what they found. They said it was the most perfect example of geometric perfection, and it has not needed any kind of structural repair in its entire existence of over 1,000 years. And at the back of the Cordoba Mesquita is a display of the masons' marks. And you can see from looking at those that these are all Arab names. So it's very clear that the builders of the Mesquita were Arabs. A lot of Syrians came across from, because the Abbasids obviously moved the capital to Baghdad, and Damascus became, much, well, not a backwater exactly, but it lost all its importance. And so a lot of Syrians who had been happy under the Umayyads came to Spain, and Abdurrahman put out a call, in fact, asking everybody to come who was sympathetic to him. So a lot of skilled craftsmen came, and they were then involved in building the Cordoba Mesquita. And this is the mihrab of the Cordoba Mesquita. And again, you look at the top there, the row of trefoil arches, 7 trefoil arches across the top in the most holy place, in the mihrab. Very, very influential. And this was centuries ahead of when it was started to be used in Gothic architecture. And also the use of the horseshoe arch there. And inside the Cordoba Mesquita, it is a whole series of horseshoe arches, double arches for the first time, to give this. And when you enter that mosque, you have no sense of where the beginning and where the end is. That it's a very, very different concept to church architecture, which has a strict hierarchy. You enter and you know exactly where the important bits are, and only important people are allowed to be up at the front by the altar, and then the choir, and then the congregation is confined to the back of the church. In a mosque, in the Cordoba Mesquita, you can see this very clearly. There is no hierarchy. You enter it and you don't know where the beginning and the end is. It's this very different sense of space, basically, of how to relate to space. And the idea is that when you enter it, you feel at one. There is no intermediary between you and God. You immediately enter this spiritual atmosphere. And arches are everywhere. So on the exterior of the Cordova Mesquita, on the right-hand side there, you will see one of the many gates on the outside of the Mesquita. Again, you've got the little arcade of trefoil arches running along the top there. You've got a horseshoe arch underneath. Everything is covered in arches. I mean, Arab architects loved arches. The arch never sleeps is the proverb. And so arches are literally everywhere. On the right-hand side, this is still one of the gateways of the Cordova Mesquita. You've got these interlocking pointed arches now along the decorating the outside. And on the left-hand side there, you've got a copy of this in Durham Cathedral, one of the earliest examples of the use of the pointed arch in this country, in England, in the Normans brought over these styles to this country and used it in Durham Cathedral. And this where this is actually from is called the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral. And still inside the Cordova Mesquita, the trefoil arch then evolved into the cinquefoil, and then that means 5 lobes in the arch, and then 7 lobes, and more lobes basically. And of course, because it was converted into a cathedral, you've got the rather incongruous sight of crucifixes in these Muslim arches. And here you've got a multifoil arch now. This is now no longer the Mesquita, this is the Cordova Synagogue, because the local Jews in Cordova, who worked alongside the Muslims and who worked alongside the Christians, it was a multicultural center, they liked the style, the Islamic architectural styles, and so they used them in their synagogues. And when the Jews too were expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in the Great Catholic Reconquista, they used the Islamic architecture in their new synagogues too, which they then built in places like Berlin and in other places. A lot of them went to the Ottoman Empire and were able to rebuild in the Islamic style that they preferred. Now, this is a picture of Amalfi, which is on the coast of Italy, and I'm showing you this because this is one of the main gateways apart from Spain. Now, we've seen how in Spain we had the beginnings, we had the pointed arch and all the other arches, but the way that the pointed arch actually entered Europe straight into things like cathedrals and monasteries was via Amalfi. Around the year 1000, Amalfi merchants were trading with cities like Alexandria and Cairo, and the Amalfi merchants saw the pointed arches of the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo and liked it very much and decided they wanted to have this style built in Amalfi's cathedral. And so they imported the laborers, the craftsmen, and some of the materials, and they built Amalfi Cathedral with pointed arches. And then the abbot, Benedictine abbot, came to visit Amalfi to buy some precious goods, and he saw the pointed arch and liked it very much on Amalfi Cathedral and decided he wanted it in his abbey of Monte Cassino. And so he too imported the craftsmen and the materials and put it in Monte Cassino. And then the abbot of Cluny, which is the absolute headquarters powerhouse of the Benedictines, the most important and powerful Christian order in Europe at that time, he saw it and decided he wanted it in Cluny. And so then pointed arches appear for the first time in Cluny, and once Cluny had it, then it became all the rage, the fashion, if you like. Every bishop in every city wanted pointed arches. And the reason we know all of this, incidentally, is because the bishops and abbots recorded it themselves in their own archives. So these are facts that are recorded as to how the pointed arch entered Europe. And so the Benedictines, they controlled the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. And so all along that route, they started to build in the style that they then had imported, if you like, from via Amalfi and through the other Islamic styles that they liked, like this alternating colors here, ablak it's called, which is very Syrian style, alternating black and white. Sometimes it's red and white, as it was in Spain, because red and white were the colors of Abdurrahman. But black and white is very common, and in this, which is it's the Cathedral of Le Puy in central France, on the road to Santiago de Compostela, the Kufic script is being used because the Benedictines and the Normans had misinterpreted Arabic script as holy script. They thought it was the language of Christ, and so they copied it in cathedrals and on garments, and important fine garments were with Arabic script on them. And at this time, you also start to see in Christian manuscripts of around the 12th century, images of God appearing as architect, the architect of the universe, holding a pair of compasses. And again, this is sort of, the king geometer, if you like, of the universe, God designing the universe with a compass. And this is very important to show how the use of geometry was now entering Europe in a way that was revolutionary. Now, military architecture was also very influenced by Islamic architecture. So here we have the ruined castle of Chateau Gaillard, which is on overlooking the Seine in France, between Rouen and Paris. And it was built by Richard the Lionheart on his return from crusade. He amalgamated all the features that he had seen in Muslim castles. And so the round shapes, which were much better for rebuffing cannonballs and anything that was any projectiles that were thrown at the walls, this sort of scalloped shape, the keep, and matriculations, all sorts of features. And it was Richard the Lionheart's favorite castle. He spent the last 2 years of his life there and referred to it as my fairy castle. And this now is the 15th century map of Jerusalem. And this was very influential because it was the very first pictorial map of Jerusalem to be printed in many languages and in many countries across Europe. And what it shows, at pride of place, right in the middle of Jerusalem, is the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim shrine, sporting an onion dome, which of course it never did in reality. But this is the European imagination. But the reason that the Dome of the Rock is the center of this map is because the Crusaders and the Knights Templar, when they took Jerusalem, they mistook the Dome of the Rock for the Temple of Solomon. And so it's labeled in maps as the Temple of Solomon. And they thought the Palace of Solomon was the Al-Aqsa Mosque beside it. So this is what they adopted as the center of Jerusalem, the holy shrine. They were using an Islamic shrine as their headquarters, if you like, as their central symbol. And then it appeared on their coins. And churches across Europe, like the Temple Church in London, like the Round Church in Cambridge, there are several in Portugal, copied this style, thinking of it as the holiest kind of church that you could possibly build, because it was the center of Jerusalem, not realizing that it was actually a Muslim shrine, which I found absolutely hilarious. And I spotted this map in an exhibition at the British Museum that happened to be on when I was researching this book. Now, Christopher Wren, to go back to him for a moment, mentions several places that he thinks of as very Saracen cities, and Venice is one of them. And here we have St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which, again, when you look at the designs of the basilica, it is so obviously Islamic that the domes, the double domes of the Islamic, the vaulting, if you like, that Christopher Wren identified, where you have a hollow dome, so the exterior and the interior are different, and that's to make it lighter and to give you more height. And if you look at the battlements, you know, full of all these very elaborate decorations, this sort of delicate tracery, I mean, it's so clearly Islamic in style. And Venice, when you walk around it, you can feel I mean, Venice was incredibly influenced by the Islamic world. It was trading with the Islamic world. That's what its wealth was all built on. And for the chapter in my book where I write about all of this, I relied heavily on the work of an academic called Deborah Howard, who wrote a wonderful book called Venice and the East. And it took her 10 years. She was the professor of architectural history at Cambridge University. And it's a beautifully researched book, and I heartily recommend that as well. Now we come to Istanbul, where Sinan, this is the Süleymaniye mosque in Istanbul, and Sinan is a direct contemporary of Christopher Wren, and it's quite interesting to just look slightly at the parallels, because both men lived to be 90. They both served under many masters. So Sinan managed to serve under 3 different sultans, so he was clearly a very diplomatic guy. He managed to, you know, retain the position of court architect for all that time. And Christopher Wren likewise was alive throughout a very turbulent period in English history, and he served under 5 different monarchs and had to stay in, you know, in favor as the royal architect. And both men used very similar styles and designs. I mean, it's something I examine a little bit in the book. And when you look at the vaulting, so Sinan's masterpiece is reckoned to be the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, the second Ottoman capital. And on the left of your screen, you'll see the vaulting of the domes in this Selimiye Mosque. And on the right-hand side of your screen is the domes of St. Paul's Cathedral. And you can see the similarities. You can see how this use of semi-domes supporting the main dome, all of these things are very similar in the 2 men's work. And although Christopher Wren never traveled to the East, he was very open to new ideas that were coming in. And so when other people traveled there, he would ask them to draw pictures, to explain to him. He would ask about how they got the lead to stay on the roof, all sorts of questions like that he wanted. He was a very curious man. He was always wanting new information because he wanted to use the best. For him, architecture was for eternity, he said. And so he wanted to use the absolute best in materials and in techniques. Now, this is also in the Selimiye Mosque, just to remind people that Islam too has stained glass windows right from the beginning. But of course, the subject matter is very different. Again, it's gardens and from quotes from the Quran and just the names of the first 4 Rashidun caliphs. So the subject matter is different, but the idea is the same. It's a holy window, a sacred window. And here in Venice, again, you can see how all the Islamic style, so you've got the pointed trefoil arches over on the left on this palace. In the middle palace there, you've got that round design that's known as the telephone dial motif, which is directly taken off Mamluk palaces in Cairo. So again, the Venetians unashamedly copied all these things and put them on their own wealthy merchants' palaces because they liked them. They thought they were very beautiful and they wanted to use them. And on the right-hand side of your screen there, you've got the Doge's palace, again with this very, very detailed, beautifully carved, is very Islamic style of, and the dimensions of the Doge's palace, according to Deborah Howard's book, were actually modeled on the Al-Aqsa mosque in Jerusalem. So again, conscious copying of Islamic styles. And now here on the left is Burgos Cathedral, which is another cathedral in northern Spain on the way to Santiago de Compostela. And this is another building which Christopher Wren referred to as Saracen in style. And he said, from the lightness of its work, the excessive boldness of its elevations, the delicacy, profusion, and extravagant fancy of its ornaments, it could only be attributed to the Moors, or what is the same thing, to the Arabians or Saracens, he said. And on the right-hand side of your screen there, you've got a modern 20th century building of Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which is the most incredible fusion of Hispano-Saracenic Gothic. It is the ultimate fusion of nature, geometry, and religion. And it's due to be completed in 2026. And Gaudi, again, was unashamedly influenced by Islamic architecture. And he said, I am a geometrician. That is to say, I synthesize. And this is a detail of the Sagrada Familia, which will remind you of the facades of the Umayyad Mushatta Palace with its sheer detailing and the bursting with life, except this one has got obviously figures in it rather than animals. And now the Gothic revival, we've got Big Ben there covered in trefoil arches and like a square bell tower going up in registers, becoming more and more delicate towards the top. The Houses of Parliament covered in trefoil arches. We've got the Brighton Pavilion with its multifoil arches and chimney minarets and domes. We've got Montmartre in Paris with its Islamic domes, and on its own website it admits Islamic influence. And then we go across the Atlantic to America, where this is the Washington National Cathedral, where you can see all the elements of Gothic: twin towers, rose windows, pointed arches, trefoil arches. And even in American universities, this is Yale University campus. On the right there, you've got the Lending Library, which looks like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And on the left, you've got Harkness Tower, which looks like a Gothic tower. And then in Washington, D.C., the US Capitol dome itself uses Islamic vaulting on the inside. It is the double dome Islamic vaulting. And so I'm going to end there. And just to conclude with Rowan Williams's endorsement of this book, which I was very, very touched by, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, because he totally understood what this book is about. It's basically about the way that cultures, religious cultures, interact and interweave in ways that challenge all kinds of assumptions. And so this is what it's really all about, that everything builds on everything else. And nobody owns architecture, nobody owns science, but the best kinds of architecture are a synthesis of something new. And that is exactly what Islamic architecture did and was so influential in so many of our monuments across Europe. So thank you very much for listening to that. And I hope I have not overrun too much. I have slightly, sorry about that. I get carried away.
No worries, that was great. Thank you very much, Diana. A really eye-opening session for me, and I know looking at some of the questions coming through in the chat that everyone really enjoyed that. Just from some of the topics you talked about, starting off with Notre Dame, but then about the Syrian stonemasons, the Syrian glass as well, and then obviously about the dome of the rock and how that's sometimes been misidentified. Yeah, really fascinating stuff. We've just got a couple of minutes to run through some of the questions. Apologies if we don't get to your one. One of the questions which came up a number of times is why do you think that I guess even nowadays, you've got experts in the field who aren't, I guess, aren't aware of some of the things that you've touched on, and that some of those messages aren't being spread that widely. And kind of why do you think that is?
I think it's the education system, to be honest. And what's clear to me when I read a lot of art history books and architectural history books is that they're written from a very European perspective. And I mean, I'm a product of that education system myself. I was brought up to believe from my school days that Greece and Rome were the origin of all civilization. That was it, really. It was only when I switched to Arabic and went east of Greece for the first time in my life that I realized, wait a minute, even the Greeks got most of their things from further east. You know, all the things we think of as quintessentially Greek, in fact, were just adaptations of what they saw from earlier cultures, more advanced than them, further to the east. So, you know, it became obvious to me that you know, Europe was not the center of everything. It didn't invent everything, but a lot of, you know, architectural historians, particularly of my generation, say, you know, because they're not familiar with you know, most of them, you know, haven't been to the Middle East, and of course, tragically, for the last 10 years or so, it hasn't actually been very easy to get to places like Syria and go and see these buildings for yourself. You know, I was very lucky to be able to do all of that, and I was already familiar with European architecture. You know, my mother's German, and so, you know, as children we used to travel around France and Germany a lot. So we grew up seeing medieval Gothic cathedrals, and you know, but when I studied Arabic, as I said, you know, my eyes were opened basically, and so I think that's what it is. The education system needs to be updated, and I mean, I'm well aware that, you know, the book in a sense is a bit pioneering in that sense. And to judge from the reaction, I think you know, a lot of things will slowly change as more people do more research into all of this and realize how valid it all is.
Sure. Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. And I guess touching on that education point, obviously we know you've got a successful book which had a glowing recommendation at the end there. Do you have any other recommendations of resources that people could look at to find out a bit more about Islamic architecture within Europe? I guess either books or online. Have you had any recommendations?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the Deborah Howard book, Venice in the East, is a very, very interesting book. To be frank, a lot of the material I found is not so much in books, but in articles, and of course that's rather less accessible. One very accessible book that's been written recently, actually, is called Minarets in the Mountains by Tariq Hussein, and he's a British Muslim, and he goes with his family to the Balkans in search of Ottoman Europe. And he is amazed at what he finds. And I mean, architecture is just part of his story, if you like, but it's a very nice book, and it's done extremely well, actually, because again, he's opened up windows onto things that so many people just didn't realize, you know, how Ottoman the Balkans still are, and how there are all these mosques in Europe, you know, in the mountains. And you know, a lot of Balkan nationalist sentiment has tried to sort of deny its Ottoman past, but you know, there's no denying it. I mean, it's all of the Balkans are infused with Ottoman lifestyle and architecture, and you know, what they call Bulgarian Renaissance architecture is basically just Ottoman architecture painted a different color.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you. And I think we just have time for one more question, and apologies again that we couldn't get through all of them. One of the questions was, did the Romans and the Byzantines not have some role to play in the influence and progression of this architecture, such as the Roman construction techniques to produce Islamic or Middle Eastern looking features? So is there perhaps an element of exchange of knowledge rather than stealing?
Well, yes, yes. As I explained, the stealing is a pun on the Saracens' derivation. It doesn't mean literally stealing.
Sure.
I mean, as I explained, everything is a case of learning and adapting, and the blending of cultures, and the skills then gradually pass over. I mean, interestingly, Islamic architecture is not particularly influenced by Roman things. Actually, that's what's quite striking in a way, and you see it in places like Syria. So, actually, this is another book that I would recommend. It's by a guy called Warwick Ball, and he's written a book called Rome in the East, which won a number of prizes, and it's brilliant at explaining how different the Roman Empire, and don't forget, the Roman Empire was multicultural and multi-ethnic. Any Roman citizen could become, emperor, and of course, the first Christians were a mix of ethnicities as well. We mustn't forget that both the Byzantine and the Roman empires were multicultural and multi-ethnic. So, but in the East, and by the East he means Syria, as in historic Syria, which is much bigger than what the modern country of Syria. We're basically talking about the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. That Roman buildings look very different. So Palmyra looks very different to structures in Italy that are Roman. I mean, there is a love of decoration, and the quality of the stonemasonry, as I explained right at the start. Because of the nature of the material that they had, the ability of the stonemasons was way ahead of anything that Romans from other parts of the Roman Empire had.
That's great. Thanks for that response. So I think we'll leave it there. Thanks again, Diana, for your really eye-opening talk and response to some of these questions as well. It's been really great to hear from you.